you look around with me?
Out of the din of the city,
away from the noise of the crowds,
we come to rest in this moment,
in this place,
set apart from the never-ending to-do lists.
embracing the seventh day, a day of rest.
We come to the warmth and stillness
of this sacred hour.
Remember, you have chosen to be here. Something in your life led you to arrive here now.
Whatever tasks and cares await you, now, for this brief time, simply rest.
Allow your soul to be nurtured. Let the waves of your mind and heart gradually subside.
As you come home to yourself, holy and whole.
Come, let us worship together.
We bid you welcome. We do not ask what you believe or expect you to think in a certain way, but only that you try to live a kindly, helpful life with the dignity proper to a human being. Welcome all who believe that religion is wider than any sect and deeper than any set of opinions. Welcome all who might find in our friendship strength and encouragement for daily living. Good morning, and welcome to the Universalist Unitarian Church of Farmington. My name is Rosie the Riveter, also known as Beverly Church, and I've been a member here for a little over 20 years, and I'm currently Secretary of the Executive Board and also a member of the Religious Education Committee. This morning, we are very fortunate to have guest speaker Paul Vachon with us. I will tell you a little bit more about him later in the service. I'd like to extend a special welcome to any visitors today. After the service, we invite you to stay for coffee hour downstairs in Adams Hall. We also have a special event going outside for anyone who'd like to participate, treats on the trail. When in the meeting house, we're observing COVID precautions and wearing masks regardless of vaccination status. Religious education classes are being held in the RE classrooms during the service, and an usher can direct you to those locations if needed. Joys and sorrows can be shared later in the service after the offering. You're welcome to come up to the microphone. We also have blue Joys and Sorrows cards in the pews, and they can be filled out and given to the ushers during the offering and read by me later in the service. If you would like to text your joys and sorrows, please see the phone number listed on page 2 of the order of service. Please include your name on the text. At this time, please join me in our shared affirmation of mission, which is listed on page 2 of your order of service. We seek answers everywhere, include everyone, live with compassion. At this time, does anyone have any announcements?
Hey folks, really quick, Mark Petrie here, the fundraising chair, and just a reminder, if anyone has any questions about our Raise Right app that we use for shopping with gift cards, that percentage that goes to the church, please do see me, or Linda is here as well. She's our resident expert. So continue to keep that in the front of your mind. If you see the magnet, we also have an article in the magnet that Linda kindly typed up for us. And so yes, join up if you haven't yet, and we're always here to answer any questions. Thanks. And I'm sorry? Tips every week in the e-blast. Oh yes, and watch the e-blast for tips coming every week that you can review and ask us if you have any questions, of course. Okay, thanks.
Good morning. Couple things on behalf of the membership committee. First of all, as far as today, courtesy of us and the church, there's going to be cider and donuts outside for anybody who's relatively new to the church. Please hang around, grab some stuff, talk to us, give us a chance to get to know you better. And along that same line, we have a program coming up on November 20th called New UU and You. It's headed up by George Rourke, and we'll give newer people, members, guests, a chance to find out much more about the UU structure. It will probably be of good value to an awful lot of people. So thank you for your time.
Barb Eglinton here. November 8th is Election Day, and if you haven't already voted absentee ballot, you definitely get out and vote, hopefully. It also is the first installation of chalice circles, where about 10 people gather and talk about a topic. And So we're meeting at 7 o'clock in the Marge Brown Room. Everyone's welcome. There's no pre-work to be done. Our topic will be democracy.
Any other announcements? Please check the UUCF website or emails for other announcements about upcoming events. At this time, please rise as you're willing and able for our first hymn, which is number 298, Wake Now My Senses, and we will sing all 3 verses. I'm sorry, what?
Are we singing 5 verses?
Oh, it says 3 in here, but,
All right, verses 1, 2, and 3.
okay. A lifelong resident of the Detroit area, Paul Vachon is an author, freelance writer, and public speaker. He possesses a strong interest in Detroit history and has written 4 previous books devoted to the subject. He's also written guidebooks on Michigan travel. Paul is a member of the American Society of Journalists and Authors. In his spare time, Paul enjoys traveling, nature, photography, and acting in community theater. Please welcome Paul Vachon.
Well, good morning. I'd like to thank Beverly for that nice introduction, and Jessica and the whole community here at Universalist Unitarian Church of Farmington for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm a member of one of your neighboring congregations, Birmingham Unitarian Church. I want to begin by saying what an honor it is to speak in this very historic sanctuary. As many of you know, this church was originally built in 1853 at the corner of Thomas and Warner Streets in downtown Farmington. The wood used for its construction was cut at a sawmill at the corner of Powers and Grand River. In 1966, the building was placed on top of a flatbed truck and moved gently, very gently I'm sure, to its current location. During the Civil War, when this church shared its quarters with a local Quaker congregation, the famous abolitionist Sojourner Truth spoke here on a cold February morning. Her talk probably expressed some of the same substance of many others she delivered. During the period from 1851 to 1856, Truth spoke to hundreds of audiences throughout the North, proclaiming a twofold message: the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of women. So impactful was Truth to the cause for freedom that her likeness is represented today in downtown Detroit. Built to honor the sacrifices of Michiganians who served in the Civil War, The Michigan Soldiers and Sailors Monument at Campus Martius includes 4 female figures that represent the spoils of war: victory, history, union, and emancipation. While the statues have been traditionally thought to be allegorical, modern art historians theorize that sculptor Randolph Rogers did intend the emancipation figure to represent Sojourner Truth. That memorial is but one chapter of Detroit history that has been an enduring passion of mine. I'm a lifelong Detroiter, and I say that despite the fact that I live north of 8 Mile Road. In fact, outside of 4 years spent at Sacred Heart Seminary College and on the city's west side, I've always lived outside the city limits. Occasionally, when I meet someone new while out of town and I'm asked where I'm from, I say Detroit in response. Family and friends may correct me and say the Detroit area, but I've never accepted that distinction. A critical look at the region's history will, in my view, demonstrate that in a very real sense, we're all Detroiters, primarily because the present-day suburbs, where many of us physically reside, exist because of decisions made by political leaders and the population at large during the mid-20th century that were based largely on race. While many are welcoming and viable communities today, the unfortunate fact is that the entrenched racism that was the reason for their rapid expansion in the 1950s and 1960s. I was born in Detroit in 1959 and spent the first 7 years of my youth in Royal Oak. My paternal grandparents still lived on the city's east side near 7 Mile Road in John R. And as I grew a bit older, I occasionally spent nights at their home during the summer. Although I was still very young, I could sense that there was change in the air. In 1965, the block was roughly half black and half white, and the commercial strip on 7 Mile offered a small grocery, a pharmacy, a dry cleaner, and a church that had once been a movie theater. But there was also a few abandoned storefronts and an occasional boarded-up home. 6 months before the insurrection of 1967, my family moved from middle-class Royal Oak to leafy Bloomfield Hills. My neighborhood and the parochial school I attended in Birmingham were exclusively white, and not a single African-American, Jewish, or Hispanic family lived within miles. My 1977 high school graduation class totaled 159 and included only 3 blacks and a very small number of Chaldeans. Most adults I had contact with, including my parents, had grown up and lived their early adult lives in the city proper, and spoke with considerable invective regarding the state of Detroit. Most, if not all, of these comments were laced with emotional expressions of racist sentiment. Detroit was a great city when we were young, I would hear, but as the racial mix changed, blight soon followed. To them, it was just a matter of cause and effect. I'm sure many of you have heard similar stories. This feeling was undoubtedly widespread among many Caucasians, whose rapid exodus from the city became known as white flight. But is the story really that simple? Were there deeper forces at work? A critical reading of history reveals a much more complex chain of events. The Great Migration, one of the most significant social events of the 20th century, saw the movement of large swaths of the African-American population from the mostly rural South to the more urban North, primarily to cities such as New York, Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit. Their reasons were basically twofold: to access better jobs and to escape the suffocating Jim Crow laws ingrained in Southern society. This trend began in the years immediately prior to World War I and continued as the industrial North retooled to supply the military with munitions and equipment following the United States' entry into the conflict. When Henry Ford began building his Mammoth Rouge complex in Dearborn, victory boats for the U.S. Navy were among the very first products produced. And despite his well-documented anti-Semitism, Ford was willing to hire blacks when other industrialists were not. In fact, jobs for African Americans were so plentiful that they soon eclipsed black employment in the traditional service occupations, domestic servants, janitors, and the like. Due to the prevailing racial attitudes of the era, an unwritten but rigid code of residential segregation was enforced. The great majority of black residents were forced to live in a narrow strip beginning on the eastern edge of downtown and extending northward to the present-day site of the Detroit Medical Center. The area operated largely as a city within a city. Alongside the major arteries of St. Antoine and Hastings were grocery stores, pool halls, houses of worship, and a myriad of other businesses that served the black community. The neighborhood was commonly known as Black Bottom, but the name had nothing to do with the identity of the people who lived there. The moniker actually originated from the 18th century French farmers who once tilled the area to describe the color of the soil. Although it reflected a cohesive community, life in Black Bottom was anything but ideal. As succeeding waves of black migrants arrived, the resulting housing shortage forced newcomers to share quarters with relatives or even complete strangers, with as many as 8 or 10 people squeezed into 3-bedroom apartments. Absentee landlords charged exorbitant rent, yet performed little maintenance. Many of the pre-1900 buildings lacked indoor plumbing, contributing to disease. Just north of Black Bottom was Paradise Valley, the entertainment district that catered to the black community. Jazz clubs, including the 666 Lounge and the Flames Show Bar, often featured headliners such as Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, and Billie Holiday. Each year, the district's businesses would elect an unofficial mayor who would act as a liaison to the city's real mayor and city council. One of the first attempts to pierce the cloak of segregation occurred in September of 1925, when Ossian Sweet, an African-American physician, attempted to move into an East Side home he had purchased at the corner of Garland and Charlevoix Streets, in what had been an all-white area. Neighborhood residents seethed with anger and gathered en masse in front of the home one evening. Anticipating trouble, Dr. Sweet and members of his family armed themselves inside the home. When the mob began attacking by throwing rocks at the house, a shot was fired, striking and killing a man standing across the street. All 11 occupants of the home were arrested and prosecuted for murder. The NAACP hired celebrated attorney Clarence Darrow to represent the defendants. And in the end, an all-white jury deliberated for 46 hours before declaring themselves deadlocked, prompting the judge and future Detroit Mayor Frank Murphy to declare a mistrial. Prosecutors declined to retry the case. Dr. Sweet was able to return to his home, but subsequently experienced years of personal misfortune, culminating in his tragic suicide in 1960. The stress of this harrowing experience was likely a contributing factor. Over the next 2 decades, the racial order in Detroit remained virtually unchanged, with the invisible boundaries of segregation rigidly intact. As the Axis gained power in Europe and in the Pacific in the late 1930s, Detroit's auto industry was called upon to explore ways to aid the war effort should the U.S. become involved. Ford Motor Company, for example, began construction on a massive plant at Willow Run near Ypsilanti to build the B-24 Liberator bombers even before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Ford also built thousands of copies of the Willys Overland Jeep at the Rouge to meet the needs of the armed forces. Production continued to heat up, erasing the last vestiges of Depression-era unemployment. Military conscription began in 1940, which contributed to a severe labor shortage, becoming especially acute after the Pearl Harbor attack. This opened up new employment opportunities for female and African American workers, although black men were subject to the draft as well. The United Auto Workers and other industrial unions took a voluntary no-strike pledge for the duration of the conflict, despite having only recently won recognition by the automakers. But despite this spirit of cooperation, racial prejudice continued to simmer. Wildcat hate strikes, where white workers would walk off the job instead of working near black employees, became commonplace. In 1943, some 25,000 employees at the Packard plant on East Grand Boulevard walked off the job to protest the promotion of 3 African Americans. Later that summer, Detroit saw the first major urban insurrection of the 20th century. Tensions over the breakneck pace of wartime production and deep resentment among blacks over continued segregation finally boiled over. On June 20th, black and white youths began to fight on Belle Isle. Soon the chaos spilled over to the mainland, propelled by untrue stories of gangs of thugs pushing women of the opposite race off the bridge into the Detroit River. Violence soon spread to the downtown, where both blacks and whites spontaneously attacked anyone of the other race, often complete strangers. Mobs of whites pulled blacks off streetcars and beat them. African Americans stopped cars being driven by whites and did likewise. The insurrection resulted in 34 deaths, most of whom were African American, and in some 1,800 arrests. 3 days of mayhem ended only when President Franklin Roosevelt invoked the Insurrection Act of 1807 and ordered 6,000 federal troops into the city, delaying their deployment to North Africa. The end of the war produced a measure of relief to a thoroughly exhausted Detroit. It also ignited a new degree of optimism. A number of black workers, having accumulated considerable savings during the war, opted to enter the middle class by seeking out better housing for their families outside of Black Bottom. But new obstacles to integration had to be confronted. Property deeds in Detroit, in addition to other cities nationwide, commonly held restrictive covenants written into their text. These passages, inserted to preserve racial segregation, stated that a given property could only be owned, rented, or occupied by Caucasians in perpetuity. Courts routinely upheld these provisions, owing perhaps to an overriding belief in the cause and effect phenomenon I mentioned earlier. Restrictive deed covenants undergirded much of mid-century U.S. housing policy. According to historian Thomas Segrew, quote, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, and the Federal Housing Administration used racial restrictions to determine the actuarial soundness of a neighborhood. FHA underwriting manuals, in fact, encourage developers to put racial restrictions on their properties to protect the character of a neighborhood and to maintain high housing values, unquote. This discrimination produced two effects. First, it thwarted efforts by prospective black homeowners to purchase existing homes in more desirable neighborhoods, and it also encouraged developers of new subdivisions to exclude African Americans. Fortunately, restricted deed covenants were ruled unenforceable in 1948 by the U.S. Supreme Court in the ruling Shelley versus Kramer. But soon a new method was used to circumvent the decision. Redlining is a practice employed by both private concerns, such as insurance underwriters and mortgage companies, and governments to withhold services to a given neighborhood based solely on its racial or ethnic composition. Many of these decisions were based on maps drawn up in the 1930s by the HOLC. The maps were based on area description files drafted by government appraisers under the racist presumption that integration and diversity were inherently bad, and that the more segregated a neighborhood was, the more desirable it would be for developers. The HOLC maps proved to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Recent studies show that the neighborhoods redlined back in the 1930s are even today much more likely to be low income and segregated. A physical reminder of the area exists even today. In 1941, a developer was interested in constructing single-family homes for whites only in the Pembroke neighborhood on the city's northwest side. Existing HOLC maps, however, redlined the surrounding areas, casting them as blighted and therefore high risk. They also happen to be predominantly African American. The FHA, therefore, refused to provide the developer loans and mortgage guarantees. But a compromise was brokered where the government would offer the financing if the developer erected a wall separating the black homes from the newer homes for whites. Alternatively referenced as the Birwood Wall, the Detroit Wall, or the Segregation Wall, the barrier is built of concrete and measures 6 feet high and 1 foot thick. It extends for 3 long blocks, almost a half a mile, between Birwood and Mendota Streets, beginning at 8 Mile Road and extending south. Ironically, much of the wall today sports murals celebrating the civil rights movement, and since 2001, it's been listed on the National Register of Historic Places. One positive development did occur, however, in the wake of the Shelley ruling, the open housing movement. Two new groups, the Mayor's Interracial Council and the Coordinating Council on Human Relations, partnered with several faith-based organizations to promote integration. In certain neighborhoods, the movement was successful, and for a relatively brief time in the 1950s, sporadic integration did exist. In others, however, militant homeowners associations and community improvement associations, as they were known, often used extreme violence to fight what they termed as a black takeover. Conversely, in other areas of the city, an unscrupulous practice called blockbusting was adopted by some real estate brokers. Blockbusting used various underhanded tactics to play on white residents' latent prejudices. In one scenario, a realtor would sell a home to an African-American family in a predominantly white neighborhood, then distribute inflammatory flyers to the neighbors referencing the impending Negro invasion while admonishing the resident to, quote, list with me before it's too late, unquote. Another tactic would be for a realtor to pay a young black woman to push a baby stroller up and down a residential block and follow up by distributing the same leaflets. Sadly, blockbusting was highly effective and exacerbated what came to be known as white flight. The mid-1950s saw Mayor Albert Cobo's slum removal project, which resulted in the condemnation and demolition of Black Bottom. Remaining residents were given very short notice to vacate. Many were renters and could not afford to purchase a home elsewhere, a fact well known to Cobo. After sitting vacant for several years, some of the land was developed to become Lafayette Park, while the western portion became the path of the Chrysler Freeway. White flight was advanced still further by two subsequent events. The first was the 1967 insurrection. By the 1960s, the 12th Street area on the near west side had become the new Black Bottom. Like its predecessor, it was an impoverished, densely populated, almost exclusively black area that was patrolled by a racist, brutal, and almost exclusively white police force. Years of abuse finally boiled over on July 23rd, 1967, when a police vice squad raided a Blind Pig, or after-hours drinking establishment, unleashing several days of looting and arson that enveloped much of the city and required the deployment of federal troops to quell the violence. In the end, 43 people were dead, mostly African Americans. The events of 1967 accelerated white flight and disinvestment. As people and economic resources left, poverty and blight were left behind in their wake. The second such event was the 1974 ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court in the case Milleken versus Bradley, and reflected intense white opposition to school integration. As white flight took hold beginning in the 1950s, school districts were established outside the city proper that were legally autonomous. Questions regarding any racial motivation and the drawing of their boundaries have never been conclusively answered, but by 1969, the Detroit branch of the NAACP strongly suspected that race had been a factor. In the mid-1970s, the enrollment of the Detroit public schools was almost 2/3 African American, while its suburban counterparts were virtually all white. This de facto racial segregation translated to a marked disparity in educational quality. In 1970, the NAACP filed a lawsuit against the state of Michigan, claiming that it had allowed a situation to occur at odds with the norms laid out in Brown versus Board of Education, the 1954 Supreme Court ruling that outlawed racial segregation in public schools. The plaintiffs won in U.S. District Court in Detroit, resulting in the imposition of a cross-district plan to bus students between the city and the suburbs to achieve racial balance. The state appealed the case to the U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, where again the plaintiffs prevailed. A subsequent appeal was heard in the U.S. Supreme Court, which drew nationwide attention. On July 25, 1974, the High Court overturned the lower court ruling by a 5-4 vote, reaffirming the status quo, dealing yet another blow to the hopes for racial integration. Over the following years, the pace of white flight from Detroit accelerated still further, cementing the region's already entrenched patterns of segregation. This complex history makes me wonder, what if Detroit's leaders had dealt with race relations in a positive way all those years ago? What if integration had been embraced and that the migration to the suburbs occurred not as a means to avoid the other, but merely to accommodate a growing population? Under these circumstances, what would southeastern Michigan look like today? When I reflect on the trends that did transpire, I often feel deeply frustrated. Many of the events I described occurred within my own lifetime. My younger, more idealistic self believed that by the turn of the 21st century, society's inevitable progress would yield a greater level of enlightenment, which would produce a renaissance of tolerance and acceptance, where justice would roll down like waters. But although a dream may be delayed, it needn't be deferred. Today, it's common to observe young people rejecting the prejudices of their parents and grandparents. More and more, Americans of all racial and religious identities see the economic and social benefits of working together as one community, casting aside the toxicity of racism and segregation. My fondest hope is that this long overdue development will continue and promote a new era of peace, like an ever-flowing stream. May it be so. Amen.
The light of our chalice would soon flicker and die without the oil that nourishes its flame. And just as this flame cannot burn without oil, this community cannot survive or thrive without the financial as well as personal support of its members and friends, the oil that keeps the flame of our liberal religious faith alive and fuels the shared mission and ministry of this fellowship. Let us now give freely and generously an offering to sustain and strengthen our shared religious community, a community of memory, hope, faith, and love. For we are now the keepers of its flame that burns for justice, its dream of beloved community, its vision of a world made whole. We would also like to take this moment to recognize the countless non-financial contributions that keep our congregation going. Each of us contributes to our congregation just by being here. Thank you. If you are visiting us for the first time and you're comfortable doing so, please stand and tell us where you're from and how you heard about us. We'd like to meet you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Joe from Toledo. I've grown over the last couple of years to respect WWII congregations, and I want to come check out this church this morning. So thanks for having me.
Welcome. Thank you. Yes. Great. Welcome. We're glad you joined us. A perfect heart is one that has known love and loss, joy and sorrow. The perfect heart is one that has been shared. As joys and sorrows of our community are shared, please direct your energy, prayers, and meditations as a gift of compassion and strength.
next Saturday, 2 and 8. So there's 2 shows, and that's the final show is next Saturday at 8. So if anyone's interested, have a good time for a couple hours. It's enjoyable. Thanks.
As we prepare to depart, we give voice to these hopes. May we know ourselves bound in community, even while we are apart. May a passion for justice burn in our lives. May we carry a light of compassion in our hearts and in our every interaction. May we be whole in our devotion to truth and always carry the lamp of peace before us.